We turn now to the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. And for this lecture, we're going to look very briefly at Thomas Aquinas' life. We're going to look at just a couple of his key ideas. Most specifically, we're going to be looking at his 5 proofs for the existence of God. And then we'll look at a few thinkers that come right after Aquinas. But to get us started, I think it might be helpful for us to start with a rough timeline of the period between 400 CE and 1517. So after 400 CE, you have the fall of Rome. And this period has sometimes been called the Dark Ages. Although what I want to argue in this lecture and in a future lecture that this label, the Dark Ages, is anything but the Dark Ages. There's a lot of intellectual activity going on there during this time period. There's progress being made in political thinking. There's progress being made even in science, which is called natural philosophy at this time. And there's intellectual progress being made in other ways as well. For example, you have the formation of modern universities. So there's evidence of classes being taught at the University of Oxford going back to 1096. And the university system during this time period was usually set aside for theology, for medicine, for law, for the arts, but you have the formation of the modern university. The University of Paris is established shortly after this, and then you have the University of Cambridge. But this is also the period of the Islamic Golden Age. And this is an important age where you have thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, who are preserving ancient writings, specifically the writings of Aristotle, which will be influential on thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and many others. And so you have a revival in Aristotelian thinking, which that influence of Aristotle certainly is there before there. As we'll see, many of the natural philosophers are very much influenced by Aristotle. But this is coming into the university, and some of those writings are being revived and preserved during this time period. And then, obviously, this leads into the Protestant Reformation, which we could say began 1517 if you want to use Martin Luther as the starting point, where he nails his 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg. And this gave birth to the Protestant Reformation. But there's just a lot of intellectual activity going on during this time period, and hopefully we can get a taste of that in these next few lectures. But to begin with Aquinas, so as I said, he's a product of the university. He's born in Naples and starts going to his first university, the University of Naples, at the age of 14. After that, he goes to the University of Paris at the age of 18, and he actually has some conflict with his family over this. They don't want him to go to the University of Paris. They certainly don't want him to become a Dominican friar, so they try to stop him from doing that. But eventually he resists. He becomes a friar at the age of 20 and eventually teaches at the University of Naples. His nickname during this time was called the Dumb Ox. And the reason why he was called the Dumb Ox is because he was famously very large, but he was also very quiet. So he didn't say a whole lot. But this nickname is not a good description for this intellectual because he wrote an extensive amount of material. By the age of 49, which is when he died, his writings really were encyclopedic. He's most famously known for his Summa Theologica, where he writes a whole explanation of his Christian theology, sort of in a question and answer format. He poses a question, then he answers his question. But he also wrote many commentaries on the books of the Bible. He wrote many commentaries on Aristotle and on other great thinkers. And so his writings really were encyclopedic. Well, perhaps what makes Aquinas so influential, among other things, is that he is the philosopher to bring Aristotle into Christian theology. Now, there are thinkers that are working with Aristotle during this time period in the Islamic tradition and within the Jewish tradition, but he's the one who starts Christian Aristotelianism. Now, this is controversial during this time period because many of the theologians are going back to Augustine, who is very much influenced by Plato. So many theologians are Platonic in their thinking, not Aristotelian. And Aquinas starts to challenge some of this And there's controversies that ensue during this time period. He considers Aristotle the philosopher. In fact, when he refers to Aristotle, he just calls him the philosopher. That's what he thinks about Aristotle. He rejects many of Plato's ideas, but interestingly, he does like Augustine's idea. In fact, he very much likes Augustine's thinking, even though he disagrees with Plato on many things. He likes Augustine's idea that the universals exist inside the mind of God. So if you go back to Aristotle and the discussion between Plato and Aristotle, Plato argued that the forms or the universals are distinct from the physical world. Aristotle argues that the forms exist inside the physical world, and so you see them embodied, the forms, but there's no extra world. Well, this would be a place where Aquinas is disagreeing with Aristotle, even though he relies so much on Aristotle, because it actually gets into his understanding of the human person. So now during this time period, there is a debate in Islamic thinking about the nature of the human person. And they trace some of their debates back to Aristotle. So you have Avicenna, who is arguing that the human soul is immaterial and immortal. And so he's trying to interpret Aristotle within that framework, even though that's not consistent with Aristotle's thought, where you have Averroes, who Aquinas actually calls the commentator. So he thinks that Averroes gets it right when he's interpreting Aristotle, that individuals actually cease to exist at death. Now, even though he thinks Averroes gets it right, he's the commentator of the philosopher. Aquinas says at this point he wants to go away from the idea that individuals cease to exist at death, because obviously within Christian theology you want to have some sort of idea of life after death. And the way that Thomas Aquinas thinks about this is that after death there will be a resurrection of both body and soul. So the part of Aristotle that he holds on to is that for Aristotle, when he conceives of the human nature, body and soul must go together. Just like the forms and the particulars must go together. Wherever you have objects, you have form. Wherever you have form, you have physical objects. You can't have either without the other. And so with Aristotle, wherever you have soul, you have body. And when the soul dies, the body dies. Well, Aquinas modifies this a little bit. He argues that the soul exists in a disembodied state between the death and the resurrection, but there will be this reunion between body and soul at the resurrection, which he finds within Christian theology. He also disagrees with Aristotle when it comes to the natural world. Aristotle, if you remember, has this idea that the universe has existed forever. So you have an eternal universe in Aristotle's system of thought, whereas Thomas Aquinas develops the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, which is a doctrine that he argues is not discovered through Aristotle's philosophy. Now he does want to argue that it's not necessarily inconsistent with Aristotle's philosophy, at least the best parts of Aristotle's philosophy, but he says this is a doctrine that you really get through divine revelation. And this actually leads into a really important part of Aquinas' thought. Aquinas argued that you have nature and grace. There's this distinction between the two. With nature, this is where you have natural reason and observation. Grace is where you have divine revelation, and he's specifically thinking of Scripture. And when it comes to nature, at least when we're thinking about what we can know about God, which is for Aquinas the most important thing that we can know about, there are limits to what we can know. Now, we can know some things about God according to nature, as we'll see in a moment, but it's very limited. And so Aquinas says you have to have supernatural assistance, which you can get through divine revelation, through the Scriptures, or grace. This is how you would get to know the truths about God. So just to give a few examples, so we can know that God exists from nature. That would be a limited thing. We can know that God exists, but we learn about God's character from grace, from divine revelation. So if you think about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that there is a God who exists in three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's something that Aquinas would say you can't learn that from nature. You can only learn that from Scripture. But from nature, you can learn that God exists, and then you can learn some minimal characteristics about God, such that God would be immaterial, God would be unchangeable. He comes up with a list of sort of negative attributes that you can learn about God from nature. But he also argues that nature and grace are not in conflict with one another. And if you think about his project of trying to reconcile Christianity with Aristotle, he thinks Aristotle has a good interpretation of the natural world. So he is the philosopher. But he doesn't have a perfect interpretation of the natural world. And so when there's an apparent conflict between faith, let's say, the Christian faith, and what we know from rational philosophy, he would say it's just an apparent conflict. At some place, someone made a misinterpretation either of nature or of the Christian doctrines, because there's no final conflict between the natural world and Christian theology, or there's no conflict between nature and grace. So if we dig into then, well, what can we know about God from nature? Again, Aquinas argues we can know that God exists from nature. And here are his 5 proofs for the existence of God, to try to demonstrate what we can know about God. If you get rid of all of divine revelation, here are still the things that he thinks we can know. And his 5 arguments for God's existence, or his 5 proofs, are number 1, the proof from motion; number 2, the proof from efficient cause or efficient causation; number 3, the proof from necessary being, or you could call it the proof from contingency. You have the proof from perfection, and then you have the proof from order or direction. And when we look at the first 3 of these proofs, these are, later they'll be given the label cosmological proofs or cosmological arguments. So a cosmological argument for God's existence is a type of argument that begins with the existence of the natural world that we can observe around us, and then you reason from the natural world to the existence of some sort of higher power. His proof from perfection, number 4, we might consider this an aesthetic or a moral argument for the existence of God. And I'll give you a couple different ways of thinking about this particular proof. And then we might consider his 5th proof as being a teleological proof, which is to say that you make an argument based upon the design in things or the purpose of things, and then you infer that there must be a designer based upon the order of nature, or the apparent design of nature. And so let's look at each of these proofs in order. So first, his proof from motion. So he's very much drawing on Aristotle here. We can represent this particular proof in the following 4 statements. So statement number 1, the world is in motion. We see motion all around us. Things are changing. And here he has in mind the categories of potential versus actual. So things are moving, which means they're potentially on their way to becoming something else. They're moving to something that's actual. And statement 2, whatever is in motion was moved. And he argues this because of statement number 3, you can't derive motion from non-motion. And I'll give you an example here in a moment why he says this. But if that's the case, whatever's in motion was moved, and you can't derive motion from non-motion, then he reasons that after a series of events, a series of movers, there must be a first unmoved mover, and he frequently has these statements. Everyone understands that what this is the being of God. So what does he mean by this proof of motion? Well, if we think of the falling of dominoes, and let's just use the falling of dominoes to be an illustration of physical cause and effect in the world, going back to the beginning of creation to this moment right now. So if every domino represents movement that's going on in what Aquinas would call the created world, well, every domino that's falling is falling because a previous domino is falling on top of it. And that domino falls because a previous domino behind that falls on top of that. But, Aquinas says, every domino begins at rest. So if you look at this domino at the end of the chain of dominoes falling, that domino is actually at rest. So there's no potential inside of it to fall. The only way that it has the potential to fall is if there's a mover behind it or a cause before it that falls on top of it, and then the potential to fall is realized because there's an action that comes before it that causes it to fall. And what this means is that potential has no causal power. Because even though this domino has the potential to fall, the potential does not lie in this particular domino. It has to lie outside of it. And so if you think about this in terms of events that are going on right now, every event that's happening right now is what Aquinas means by movements. Things are changing. Things are happening. And so if you ask, why did this event happen? It's because the prior event caused it to happen. Well, why did that event happen? Because there was an event before that, and you trace it back. You arguably could trace it back into infinity, but Aquinas says that you can actually do this. Because if there is an infinite regress, then there's this question of how does potentiality bring about actuality? Because if you set up the dominoes all standing up, all the way back into infinity, every domino is actually at rest. And so what is it that gets that first domino to fall? Well, to get that first domino to fall, he argues that there must be a terminating explanation, which he calls the first mover, and that's what he says everyone understands this to be God. There must be a first mover. Well, then he moves on to his proof from efficient cause, and again, he's drawing on Aristotle. So you remember Aristotle's four causes: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, the final cause. Well, the efficient cause is the cause that is equipped to bring about the effect in question. So it's the mechanism. It's what actually has what it takes to build. In this example, we have a home. So you have to have a builder that is able to take the building plans and fashion it into a home. That's the type of cause that it will take to get your final cause. Well, his argument from efficient cause goes something like this. So if we take these four statements, number one, nothing can cause itself. And he takes that as sort of a self-evident truth, because to cause yourself, you have to exist to cause anything. But if you don't exist, how can you cause yourself? And so this would just be a self-evident statement. Nothing can cause itself. And so what follows from that? Well, every effect must have a cause. And so if nothing can cause itself and every effect must have a cause, then you can also move to statement number three. Causation cannot regress into infinity, similar to the reasons that we just mentioned with the first mover, which means there must be a first cause to which everyone gives the name God. That is his proof from efficient cause. And then he has his proof from necessary being. So here we can represent that in three statements. So everything in nature is contingent. So to call something contingent is just to say that it doesn't have to be that way. So if you can imagine something not existing, then you're saying that this thing is a contingent thing, to imagine it out of existence. But Aquinas says we can't imagine non-existence. That's something that we can't do. And so what follows from that? Well, there must be some necessary reality, and this all people speak of as God. So that's his proof from necessary being. Then you have his proof from perfection. We can represent that in two statements. So we experience degrees of perfection. So again, let's go back to Plato. You have perfect triangles, and you have the particular triangles in this world. So you don't have many perfect triangles. You just have one perfect triangle, but you have many particular triangles. And so what is it that helps us recognize when a triangle is more perfect than, say, another triangle? Well, you have the idea of perfection, and again, for Aquinas, those universals are found in the mind of God. You have many beautiful things that you can observe. Well, where do we get this universal concept of beauty? Well, again, for Aquinas, that exists in the mind of God. Or moral truths. We know that some things are morally better than other things. And so where do we get this moral sense? Well, the degrees of perfection have to culminate somewhere, and they culminate in the mind of God, a perfect being. Therefore, there must be some standard, statement number 2, that is the standard of perfection, and that's what we call God. So that's his proof from perfection. Then we have his proof from order and direction. And here we can represent this in 3 statements. So the natural world does not reduce to intelligent parts. So if you think of many things that exist in the natural world, I like to think of just consciousness and our thinking. So our thinking is reduced to our physical brain, and our physical brain, you can reduce it further down to particular neurons, and you might even be able to reduce it further to atoms, subatomic particles. But all of those parts of the natural world are not intelligent in themselves. But, Aquinas says, nevertheless, they behave in an orderly manner. So the question is, how do you get non-intelligent parts to behave in an orderly, intelligent manner? And statement 2, he says the order of nature displays purpose, and it moves towards certain ends. So if you think of all those non-intelligent parts and you think that they're moving, well, they're not just moving for no purpose whatsoever. So if you look at the development of, say, our various organs like the eye, the end of that is to be able to see something. And so the movements of development that happen in the human body show that the different organs function in a certain way. And that shows that there's a purpose for it. So there's a telos for it. Again, this is going back to Aristotle. Acorns become oak trees, and you have this very natural purpose and movement towards certain ends, which suggests for Aquinas that some intelligent being exists by whom all the natural things are directed. And then he says, this being we call God. And so those are the 5 proofs for God's existence. Now we can move to 3 other thinkers, Scotus, Occam, and Eckhart. All of these thinkers are influenced by Aquinas in some ways, and we're just going to give a very brief treatment of each of these thinkers, starting with Duns Scotus. Scotus argues for voluntarism. So this is the position that says that God's will, rather than God's reason, is supreme. And so here he is very much influenced by Aquinas, but he's going to go a different route than what Aquinas goes. So Aquinas would say that there are internal limitations to God that aren't defects of what it means to be God, because God is a fundamentally rational being, according to Aquinas. So God can't do things that are against God's nature. Scotus wants to argue the opposite. He wants to argue that God is absolutely free and God could do whatever God wants to do. And so if you ask questions like, could God make a murder morally virtuous? Well, for Scotus, God could do that because God has no limitations. God is not even limited to God's own character. So if God says murder is morally righteous, then it would be morally righteous because God says it is. Or you could take the question, could God make 2 + 2 = 5? Well, for Aquinas, I think Aquinas would say no, because that's going against the fundamental nature of God. God is a rational being, and so God couldn't make 2 + 2 = 5, where Scotus would be more on the side of saying God is absolutely free, and God could even make a world in which 2 + 2 were to equal 5. After Scotus, you have William of Occam, who is a nominalist, and he argues that universals do not exist. So think of the universals again as the Platonic forms. So the immaterial world, conceptual world that exists out there, and then you have the realm of the particulars. For Occam, he argues that what we call universals what we call the concept of dog or the concept of triangle are just words used to describe a group of particulars. He defends this position using a principle of simplicity that today is referred to as Occam's razor. So maybe you've heard of this phrase before, Occam's razor. It comes from William of Ockham, who says, what can be explained on fewer principles is explained needlessly by more. In other words, if you can reduce something to more simple explanations are to be preferred over complex explanations. And how does this apply to the concept of forms in his nominalism? Well, if we're just saying that our language is just describing particular things, certainly that's more simple and to be preferred over saying, and in addition to that, there's this other world called the realm of the forms. We don't need that principle, so we might as well just say it's human language. It's not this extra world that exists out there that we're describing. And so that's Occam's razor. We ought to prefer simplicity to complexity when it comes to explanations. Then we have mysticism. And this comes from the philosopher Eckhart, who is really referring to religion, where he's talking about religion. A lot of the philosophical speculation that's going on during this time is directly related to religion. And he argues that religion should be less about reason and more about our direct experiences with God. He was a mystic and preferred those mystical experiences. And one of the reasons why he argues this could be stated in a question. So reason is limited. He's going to make that assumption. And you can make an argument, just like many of the previous philosophers who have made similar arguments, that people have not persuaded each other with the use of reason. And so it must be limited. And if it's limited, why would we place so much trust in it? Instead, we should trust in our experiences or our feelings, in our mystical experiences of God. And this represents another approach to thinking about religion during this time period, which isn't a rational approach, but it's more of an experiential approach.